Let's also take a moment to talk about Troubleshooting X Windows. Xorg, or Zorg as you may call it, uses several configuration files, and errors in any one of those configuration files could cause X Windows not to start at all or to behave erratically. Now, most of the files that you're going to be looking for that help configure X are in the /etc/x11 folder. Now, one primary configuration file that you're most likely to be looking at more than any of them is the zorg.conf, xorg.conf file. And you can actually go in and edit that with a simple text editor. You can also regenerate that based upon system settings that have changed, such as you've changed hardware such as mouse, keyboard, video. You can recreate that file by running a simple utility, xconfigure. There's another file as well that you may want to look at, and we'll take a look at it as well, and that's the /etc/rc.conf. And we've seen that file before throughout. That's a very important file for helping us configure Unix in general, and it has a couple of entries in there that you may want to pay attention to if you're having problems with X. And again, hardware configuration can contribute to issues in X, so you don't want to limit your troubleshooting to just playing with these configuration files. You may have to go back and set hardware options, such as resolution, refresh rate, and so forth on your video, or you may need to have another mouse driver or keyboard mapping in the system as well to help X run right. So let's go ahead and take a look at these files really quick that show us how X is configured. We're in our FreeBSD virtual machine, and a couple of files I want to take a look at with you are the x.config file, the zorg.config file rather, and the rc.conf. And I also want to show you how to regenerate a new zorg.config file. What we want to do first is, let's do a less on /etc/x11/zorg.conf, and actually have to type this out a little bit differently. Big X. As you know, Unix is very case sensitive. So we've got our file here. This is the zorg.conf file, and it's broken up into sections, and each section has a section header and a section footer, and then an identifier, so it's a server layout, files, module, and so forth. It's actually very easy to configure once you figure out how it's laid out. And I'll talk about the different input devices that you have to specify and paths for files. Sometimes you may have to change those depending upon if you've installed something in a different directory. Input devices basically tell you what a keyboard and mouse you have, and it'll define the protocol and which driver uses. So if you change drivers for a keyboard or a mouse or a monitor, you may have to specify that here. And there's some other different options too, such as configuring your screens and displays. And if you decide to play with this file, it'd be a good idea to read up on it and kind of figure out what each section does and what different parameters you're allowed to put in there. But essentially, it's a very easy file to configure and view. Let's take a look at rc.conf for a second. And there's two entries in here I want to point out to you. The HAL_D_enabled equals yes, and the dbus_enable equals yes. And those two entries actually can prevent, if they're not configured right, and one of them is not intentionally, by the way, if those entries are not configured correctly, then you may not get your mouse and keyboard. Now here we see a problem because it's HAL_D_enabled, and it should be enable, no D there. So that would cause the X Windows to probably behave erratically. The other issue is if you don't see these two lines in there at all. If they're not in there at all, you'd have to go in there with the text editor and add them in there. HAL_D_enable equals yes, and dbus_enable equals yes. Those two entries need to be in there, at least in FreeBSD Unix and other forms of Unix and Linux as well, in order to get X Windows to work correctly. So now in order to fix something, we'd have to go in and delete that D out of enabled with the HAL_D line there, and that might fix some problems. So keep an eye on those two entries for correct syntax and spelling, and to make sure they even exist in there at all. Now another thing I want to show you basically is how to generate a new zorg.conf file. And what we want to do is go ahead and run a command called x-configure. And what x-configure will do after you've replaced, if you've changed out hardware such as video card or keyboard and mouse, rerunning x-configure is a good way to make sure those changes are picked up and put in the xorg.conf file, the configuration file. So we run x-configure. It's going to generate us a new file, and at the bottom you can see here that it told us that we have a new file is /root/zorg.conf.new. And if we test it, then we basically would test this, and if it works, then we would go ahead and take that file and rename it to zorg.conf and put it in the x11 directory. So in order to test this, we would say x-config/root/zorg.conf.new. And you might also want to add the retro switch on here to take into account earlier versions of X if you have them on your system, or older hardware. And that's just my opinion, of course. You don't have to run it with that. So if we run it We're going to get a little bit of configuration there, and we've got our video there. So that's what you're going to get to test that file. We've got our mouse pointer, and we've got just a gray screen that shows us that X is working. So in order to terminate that, we can switch back to our BTTY1 terminal and do a Control-C on that. And so now we know that's working. Now, of course, we would just have to copy that zorg.conf.new to /etc/x11zorg.conf, and we would have that file in there now. So now that we've looked at our zorg.conf file, we've checked our rc.conf file, we've made a couple of changes, and now we have our X Windows up and running again. So any of those actions and looking at hardware would help you troubleshoot a faulty X Windows configuration and make sure it's up and running.